A widow held her baby and faced the gallows, but the words she spoke broke the hangman's heart. The courtroom was packed, thick with tension. Ellen sat at the front, holding her baby close to her chest, the weight of the trial pressing down on her like a stone. She kept her face calm, her eyes lowered, but her grief was raw beneath the surface. The sheriff, Thompson, stood beside her, indifferent, his arms folded, eyes blank. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, looked down at her like she was just another case to close. "You've heard the accusations," the judge said, his voice gruff. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Darren, the prosecutor, stood and pointed at her, voice cutting through the silence. "You killed him. You got no excuse." Ellen didn't flinch. She lifted her head slowly, her voice steady but broken. "I had no choice." The room went quiet. The judge sighed deeply, looking down at the papers in front of him. "The law doesn't care for excuses," he muttered, but Ellen didn't back down. She had been through worse. She had seen violence, lived it. She spoke now not because she expected sympathy, but because the truth needed to be heard. "He hurt me. He hurt others. You've all seen it, and you let it happen." Her words cut through the room like a blade. Darren didn't respond, his mouth shut tight, while the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even the hangman, standing near the back, couldn't look at her anymore. Ellen's eyes met his for just a moment. She wasn't asking for mercy, and she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for the truth to be acknowledged. "Darren, you killed him. You got no excuse." "Ellen, I had no choice." "Judge, the law doesn't care for excuses." The prison yard was crowded with onlookers, a mix of men and women, old and young, all gathered to witness the final moments of Ellen's life. The rope swayed gently in the breeze, its presence ominous, casting a dark shadow over the dusty ground. The crowd's murmurs were a low, restless hum, punctuated by the occasional shout of justice, or "She deserves it." The air smelled of dust and sweat, and the tension was so thick it felt like you could touch it. Ellen's steps were slow but steady, each footfall firm against the earth beneath her. Her baby, wrapped tightly in her arms, was silent, its small face calm, as if untouched by the madness around them. The sheriff, Thompson, walked beside her, his hand never leaving the grip of his revolver. He had been through many executions, seen many faces of death, but something about this one felt different. His gaze flickered briefly to Ellen's face, and for a moment something like doubt passed through his eyes, but he quickly buried it, and his jaw tightened in response. There was no room for compassion in this town, not for people like Ellen. The hangman, Carl, stood near the gallows, watching her approach. His face was unreadable, a mask of indifference. He adjusted his noose mechanically, his hands moving in familiar, practiced motions. His eyes stayed on the rope, avoiding Ellen's gaze. This was his job. It had always been his job. No one ever asked for the man behind the rope, and Carl had never cared about the faces he sent to their graves. But as Ellen drew nearer, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't expected. Ellen wasn't begging. She wasn't pleading. Her eyes were calm, unflinching, locked forward as if she had already accepted her fate. The crowd shouted, some jeering, others calling for her death with a zeal that sickened Carl. But Ellen didn't flinch. She didn't look at them. Instead, her eyes were fixed on Carl. For a moment, their gazes met, long enough for Carl to feel something stir inside him, a feeling he didn't want to acknowledge. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Ellen's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. She didn't yell at him, didn't beg. She spoke to him as if she knew exactly what he was feeling, as if she could see through the walls he had built around himself. Carl's hands paused, his fingers stilling on the rope. He didn't answer. What could he say? The crowd's taunts grew louder. "Hurry it up," someone yelled. But Ellen's voice cut through it all, calm, unwavering. "My baby will never know his father," she continued, her words steady despite the weight of the moment. "And you'll never know the truth." Carl froze. For the first time, his hands trembled. He had placed a noose around countless necks, heard the words of the condemned. But this was different. Her words felt like a crack in the air, and Carl couldn't stop himself from listening. He stepped forward, his hands still gripping the rope, But as he moved to place it around her neck, something inside him shifted. It was subtle, a tremor in his chest, but it was enough to make him hesitate. The noose dangled in his hands, its weight pulling at him, a silent reminder of the life he was about to take. The crowd's jeers faded into the background as Carl looked at Ellen, really looked at her. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't the monster they all believed her to be. She was a woman, a mother, a widow, and she had been broken long before she ever raised a hand in self-defense. He couldn't do it. He couldn't finish what he had been brought here to do. Carl stepped back, his breath shallow. He couldn't hear the crowd anymore. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. His legs felt like they might give out beneath him. The rope was heavy in his hands, but it felt like it wasn't just the weight of a noose. It was the weight of every execution he had ever carried out, the weight of every life he had taken, and the weight of his own complicity in the town's twisted justice. Ellen's gaze stayed on him. Her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply watching, waiting, as if she knew what was coming before it ever arrived. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand landing heavily on Carl's shoulder, a signal to get back to his work. "Do your job, Carl. She's guilty. You know it." Carl didn't respond. He could barely hear Thompson's voice over the pounding in his ears. The sheriff's words seemed distant now, irrelevant. The crowd grew restless, impatient. But Carl couldn't move. He couldn't tie the knot, couldn't pull the lever. He wasn't sure when he had stopped seeing her as a criminal and started seeing her as something else entirely, something human. The noose slipped from his fingers, and for the first time, Carl realized he wasn't just stopping an execution. He was stopping himself from being the man he had become. "Ellen, you think you know what's right, but you don't know me. Carl, I never wanted this." The crowd's shouts grew louder, a mix of anger and confusion. "What are you waiting for?" someone yelled. "Finish it." But Carl remained frozen, his eyes fixed on Ellen, his hands trembling. He couldn't move, couldn't do it. He was caught in the gravity of her words. The crowd was growing restless. But to Carl, it felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only him and Ellen standing in the center of it all. The sheriff's hand tightened on Carl's shoulder, a reminder of what needed to be done. "Carl, what the hell's going on?" Thompson barked, his voice sharp and furious. But Carl didn't hear him. He couldn't hear anything but the beating of his heart, and Ellen's voice, calm, steady, cutting through the noise. "Go ahead, Carl," Ellen said softly, her gaze never leaving his. "Do it, or don't." Carl's hand shook even harder, the rope heavy in his grip, but his mind was racing. He could feel the eyes of the entire town on him, eyes full of anger, eyes full of judgment. But none of that mattered now. Ellen was speaking, and her voice was louder than the crowd. "My husband wasn't just a man," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "He was a monster. You don't understand. He hurt me. He hurt others. And you all turn a blind eye." The words were like a wound, opening up, spilling out the truth that had been buried for so long. Ellen didn't speak with bitterness or hatred. She spoke with the quiet, raw honesty of a woman who had nothing left to lose. And as she spoke, Carl saw something shift in the crowd. The jeers quieted, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "You're all complicit," Ellen continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, her voice gaining strength. "The ones who turn away are just as guilty as the ones who hurt." Carl's hands tightened on the rope. He had heard the whispers, the rumors about Ellen's husband, how he had treated her, how he had treated others. But no one had ever spoken the truth like this. Ellen wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was holding up a mirror to the entire town, showing their own complicity, their own sins. Carl felt his stomach turn. He looked at the familiar faces in the crowd, the faces of people he had known for years. Some were nodding, some were avoiding his gaze, but all of them were guilty in their silence. The rope in Carl's hands suddenly felt like an instrument of something much larger than justice. It felt like an instrument of oppression, a tool for those who had turned away, who had looked the other way for too long. Ellen's eyes never left his. "You've got a choice, Carl," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You can let them bury the truth, or you can let me speak it now." Carl swallowed hard, his throat tight, as he stared at her. The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. It wasn't just about the execution. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The silence, the complicity, the lives destroyed in the name of law and order. The crowd was growing louder again, their impatience building, but Carl couldn't move. He couldn't tie the noose, couldn't finish the job. Ellen, he killed others, Carl, and no one cared. Carl, you're asking me to make it stop, but I can't. Ellen, then you're just as guilty. The crowd shouts were deafening, rising in a furious crescendo. The pressure of the moment was thick in the air, but Carl couldn't hear them. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The rope in his hand seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, pulling him deeper into the guilt he had long buried. His eyes, once cold and impassive, now darted between the crowd and Ellen, who stood unwavering before him. The silence between them stretched, and Carl's hands, which had once been so sure, were shaking uncontrollably now. Ellen's voice had cut through the chaos, and now it echoed in Carl's mind. She had spoken of betrayal, of pain, of the things that could no longer be hidden. She had turned the tables, shifted the blame onto the very people who had hidden behind their laws, their rules, their silence. Her words were like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him with the truth. Carl's mind was in turmoil. He had been a hangman for so long. It had become nothing more than a job, a mechanical process. He was never asked a question, never expected to feel anything for those he sent to their deaths. It was the law, after all. But this felt different. The way she looked at him, as if she could see the very man he had become. The way her eyes didn't waver, even when the crowd roared for her blood. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being forgotten, of her truth being buried like everything else. Carl's breath came in shallow gasps. His hands trembled more now, the rope slipping between his fingers as he tried to gather himself. But he couldn't move. The weight of every execution he had carried out pressed on him now, like the ghost of every life he had taken, haunting him in a way he never thought possible. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence, his tone full of frustration. Carl, for God's sake, do your job. We've got a job to finish here. Thompson's voice was stern, but Carl couldn't shake the feeling that even the sheriff's commands were distant, irrelevant. Carl took a step back, the rope slipping from his hands as his knees began to buckle. He had always been so sure, so cold, but now he couldn't bring himself to finish the job. His mind flashed back to the first man he had hung. The guilt had been easier then. The faces were easier to forget. But Ellen's face wasn't easy to forget. She wasn't just another criminal. She wasn't the woman they had painted her to be. She was a mother, a wife, a victim. And in that moment, Carl saw something in her that shattered the wall he had built around himself for years. He took another step back, his heart pounding in his chest, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and he was drowning in it. He looked at Ellen, and for the first time he saw the depth of her pain, the quiet dignity with which she had endured it all. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, and in them, Carl saw something he had never allowed himself to feel: guilt. Not just for the life he was about to take, but for the lives he had already taken. The crowd's voices grew louder, more insistent, but Carl couldn't move. He looked at the sheriff, who was staring at him now with a mixture of anger and confusion. Carl, Thompson said, his voice strained. What's going on here? Carl shook his head, his body trembling. I can't do it, he whispered to himself, more than to anyone else. I can't. His hands dropped the rope, and he stepped back further, as if trying to escape the gravity of the moment. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, their expectations shattered. Ellen's gaze never left him. She was still standing there, her baby held tightly in her arms, but there was something else in her eyes now, a recognition, a quiet understanding that the world wasn't as simple as the law made out to be. She had been right all along. Her truth had to be heard. Carl finally looked up at her, his face pale and shaken. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have seen it. Ellen didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her gaze softened, and for the first time since she'd been dragged into this nightmare, she felt something like peace settle in her chest. She wasn't going to die today. Not like this. And maybe, just maybe, the truth would find its way out after all. The sheriff's anger was palpable as he stepped toward Carl, his hand tight on his gun. "What the hell is this, Carl?" Thompson growled, his face red with frustration. "You've got a job to do." But Carl didn't move. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his hands shaking, as he realized the truth. The town wasn't going to let Ellen's death be justice. Not anymore. Ellen, still holding her baby, stepped forward. "You want to kill me, Thompson? Or you want to listen to what I have to say?" Her voice was calm now, but there was strength in it, strength that reached all the way to Carl. Thompson's face was a mask of rage, but Ellen didn't flinch. She stood tall, the truth of what she had said hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. The sheriff was trapped now, caught between the old order and the new, between the laws he had always followed and the truth that could no longer be ignored. Carl looked at the rope in his hands, the weight of it pulling him down. He dropped it, and for the first time, he allowed himself to hear the truth. "Carl, I can't do it. Not anymore." "Sheriff Thompson, what the hell's going on here, Carl?" "Ellen, you want to kill me? Or you want to listen to what I have to say?" The crowd's fury intensified, their voices rising like a storm. Some screamed for the execution to proceed, while others shouted for justice, their demands blending into a cacophony of anger. Ellen stood silent at the gallows, her baby still in her arms, her face calm but resolute. The weight of the moment pressed down on Carl, who was still holding the rope, unable to move, unable to act. His hands trembled, and his mind was clouded with doubt. Ellen's words echoed in his ears, cutting through the noise, and for the first time, he was questioning everything. Sheriff Thompson stood nearby, his hand tight on his gun, but his eyes were on Carl now, confusion and anger mingling on his face. "Carl, what the hell is going on?" he growled, the urgency in his voice growing. But Carl couldn't respond. He couldn't hear the sheriff anymore, couldn't hear anything but the pounding of his own heart. "You've got a choice," Ellen said, her voice steady, almost serene amidst the chaos. "You can hang me, like you've done to so many others, or you can face the truth and stop this." Thompson's hand tightened on his gun, but his gaze shifted from Carl to Ellen. For a moment, he looked at her, really looked at her, and something inside him shifted. He had spent his life upholding the law, enforcing justice as he saw it. But now, in this moment, the lines between right and wrong had blurred. "I'm not sure I can stop this," the sheriff muttered, his voice thick with uncertainty. Ellen's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to stop it, Sheriff, but you could help me make sure the truth doesn't die here." Her voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it that cut through everything. The crowd was shouting now, demanding action, but Ellen's words had struck a chord with Carl. He looked at her, his hands shaking, the weight of the rope in his fingers heavier than ever. The truth was out there now, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Carl stepped back, his breath shallow, his body numb. He couldn't do it. He couldn't hang her. He couldn't be the one to end her life when she had spoken the truth so clearly. The sheriff's voice broke through his thoughts. "Take her down, Carl," Thompson ordered, his tone strained. For a moment, Carl hesitated, but then he dropped the rope. The crowd fell into stunned silence as Carl stepped away from the gallows. The weight of the decision, of the truth, hung heavily in the air. Ellen stood tall, the truth already spoken, and she knew something had changed. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. "Sheriff Thompson, you got what you wanted, Ellen, but I don't know what comes next." "Ellen, neither do I, but I'm ready to face it." "Carl, I'm sorry. I should have seen it."